On this transition to the Trump administration as we begin the week. President Biden bolstering formal support for Ukraine, including military operations that go against Russia and Putin. And that is being done specifically amidst concerns that foreign policy against that region, how we deal with Putin, could change with President-elect Trump taking power in January. So that's a big story, and we have that coming up, as well as right now this news from President-elect Trump that he intends to proclaim emergency powers when he does enter office, that he would declare a, quote, national emergency in order to deploy the military to conduct mass deportations. This news is now setting the expectations for the way that President-elect Trump plans to govern on that and potentially other issues. I will say it to you as straightforward as possible. It is a much more assertive approach than his first term, which was often controversial on many matters, I'm sure you remember. But this is also exactly the kind of plan that Donald Trump campaigned on. So he's drawing headlines today about both the method, emergency powers, military action, and the policy itself, these type of deportations. And it builds on Donald Trump's often stated view that undocumented immigrants must be forcibly removed, that harsher policies would dissuade the long-term and ongoing flow of migrants into the nation. So part of this story tonight, which matters, and if you're keeping track of the news right now, what you're learning tonight is very relevant to what's going to be happening in the months ahead. So it matters now and for the future. But part of the story is policy. How should this incoming president make policy based on the vows he's made, the campaign pledges he's made on immigration? The other part of it is about law. How can a president, any president, wield emergency powers? And for how long? And what are the limits? And who decides? And all of that collides with what may be Donald Trump's most controversial and currently embattled cabinet pick thus far. Matt Gaetz, tapped for Attorney General. Now, he faces criticism from both parties. I've told you before, as we cover this transitional new era, many of these things are not blue and red. A lot of Republicans are against Matt Gaetz and have even been vocal, in theory. We'll see how they vote. But it is Trump's pick of Gaetz, precisely because Matt Gaetz, former Congressman Gaetz, has voiced absolute loyalty to Donald Trump's personal and political goals. And right there, that's a difference as you look at mass deportation and these claims of military emergency powers. The complete fealty to anything Donald Trump wants is a contrast to Donald Trump's first-term picks on many key posts. That includes his first attorney general, who followed DOJ policy even when it ran quite publicly against Donald Trump's personal wishes, or his DHS and chief of staff, John Kelly, you may remember, was back in the news during the campaign. He was a major ideological conservative, and he was very, quote, tough or harsh on immigration, by the way, but he reportedly, repeatedly stood up to President Trump's demands when he thought they crossed legal lines. Trump's new proposed cabinet picks break with any such precedent. So these stories about Trump's plans, from immigration to fighting crime to vows of retribution against innocent Americans, best we can tell, they collide with the clash over this AG, Matt Gaetz, as a nominee. And it shows why even Republicans are saying tonight they need a lot more information about Gaetz's ethics record before they even consider confirming him to exactly the powerful post that would deal with everything I just mentioned and a heck of a lot more. So this is a position where now some of these Republican senators who publicly say they really are down with everything Trump wants, except confirming Gaetz, and they're at odds with the Republican Speaker, Mike Johnson.
Should the House Ethics Committee release that report, Senator?
Absolutely, and I believe the Senate should have access to that. Now, should it be released to the public or not? That's I guess that will be part of the negotiations.
And my understanding is that the report is not finished. It's in a rough draft form, was not yet ready to be released. And since Matt Gaetz left the Congress, I don't think it's appropriate to do so.
It is remarkable when you think that this was an ethics report prepared by the House under Republican control. It is their work. And yet now, because Trump has decided to elevate this person, they're saying they don't want their work even used in a confidential manner by their Republican colleagues in the Senate. And again, I will, at the risk of repeating myself, tell you, if you want an effective attorney general, you want to do this vetting up front so that they can be effective and competent in that job. completely separate to other ideological considerations. I will tell you, former Congressman Gates has denied all wrongdoing, and the DOJ did not charge him after an investigation into at least some overlapping or related conduct. The Ethics Committee is also going to meet Wednesday about all this. Now, another Trump veteran from the first term is weighing in on this, Chief of Staff from first term, Reince Priebus. And he is actually dismissing a theory you might have heard about, the recent speculation that maybe Donald Trump only picked Gates as a kind of heat-seeking distraction, knowing he probably wouldn't make it into the DOJ, and that he would both distract, waste time and energy, and then make his other nominees look more reasonable. This is a kind of a imagining of three-dimensional chess, where if you had these remember the Russian dolls? And the big one was Gates, and everyone was like, whoa. And then RFK Jr. was inside, but you don't even get to that doll because you're so busy with Gates. That's the kind of thinking we've heard as a kind of a spin. Well, here's Reince Priebus saying, even if Republicans, some of them are shocked, even if some of them oppose Matt Gates, Donald Trump really wants him in the job.
He made it very clear to me that the Matt Gates pick is not three-dimensional chess to help another nominee get through, that this was what he wanted to have happen. He feels like he's gone to hell and back 10 times. So this is also a big middle finger to the DOJ and the FBI.
Okay. That's a Trump vet who had the #1 job in the White House. And note that the explanation there is coming from Donald Trump's corner, and it is not very legitimate. The defense is not claiming this is a great pick for the nation, or claiming that Gates has some other qualifications which are somehow being undercounted by the process, by those Republican senators I mentioned. No, the Trump vet is admitting Trump sees this in personal terms. He wants to say, quote, F you to the DOJ, end quote. That's according to Trump veteran Priebus. That is the motivation. Meanwhile, DOJ vets in both parties are strenuously objecting because they say Gates has no prosecutor experience or the kind of management experience that would be necessary to run a law enforcement agency this large on day one. Now, MAGA allies have some other arguments, and I want to make sure you're familiar with them. If you've ever watched this show, you know that even when the times are intense or the stories are controversial, we will try to bring you all the evidence. They are arguing that the DOJ has previously been run by candidates with a range of backgrounds. And if you go back far enough, they say that includes political people. If you go back to, say, the Nixon administration, which isn't the greatest precedent, it is true that some of Nixon's political aides did at one point serve as attorney general. They also say if you look to people who are simply loyal to the sitting president, if you go back even farther to Robert F. Kennedy, which was, again, before the later reforms were put in precisely to add independence that they didn't have in the Hoover era and they didn't have at DOJ. But they say if you go all the way back to RFK Sr., you do have the example of someone running DOJ who was quite personally close to the president. It was his brother. So that's one wrinkle if you go back far enough. But even these MAGA defenders of Gates have yet to find any precedent, any past attorney general in any era who, apart from being this close to the president, also had publicly waged such partisan warfare, openly threatening government officials, prosecutors, and Justice Department veterans in the so-called deep state.
You had the folks leading the deep state.
The deep state is guilty.
I might be a wanted man by the deep state,
And I won't be extorted by a former DOJ officials.
Sadly, Judge, I too have lost confidence in Christopher Wray as the FBI director.
we should have a second special counsel to evaluate the misconduct of the FBI and the Department of Justice.
The deep state won't know what hit them.
Fairest way we can say it is if you are a member of Congress, you can be as partisan as you want. If you are a citizen or a person inside the United States, you have your free speech powers. You can rage against the deep state and other things as much as you want. You have that right. But the people coming into these positions, DOJ first among them, they swear an oath to a constitution, not to any person. And while I gave you the benefit of the doubt on some of the arguments they've made, if you go back far enough to find some less experienced, personally loyal attorneys general, you really can't find anyone who's ever talked like that. And then the question becomes, does he mean it? We are joined by a veteran of the Justice Department. David Kelly was the U.S. Attorney for the famed Southern District of New York. He has handled all kinds of complex cases and prosecutions. He also, full disclosure, was my former boss when I used to practice law. Welcome back.
Thank you.
I tried to run through both the connection to today's news, that an attorney general is exactly who would deal with a president claiming military powers. And so, one, how does that fit into the role you'd want, regardless of party? And two, even if you fairly mention the long history at the DOJ, have you seen anyone do the job who comes into it the way Gates would?
You know, it's interesting because even historically, I think presidents either want or should have wanted, and looking in the rearview mirror, wish they had an attorney general who can say no. And I think even RFK served that role for his brother. It's somebody who can say to him very honestly, I hear what you want to do. You can't do it that way. Can we find a different way to get it done? I'm not trying to defeat your policy. I'm trying to do it in a way that's not going to come and back and bite you in the rear end. And I think there's so many ways that can happen here, that if you have somebody who's loyal and is just a yes man, is not really going to serve the president in the way that he wants. He thinks he wants it. I don't think it will serve him the way he wants, and it won't serve the country the way it should.
When we were reporting on the efforts to overthrow the election, it was reported that Giuliani, who did cross lines, according to civil court, still told Donald Trump when he wanted the military to seize ballots that they'd both end up in jail, quote unquote. And the Jan 6 committee had a lot of testimony on that. You don't get the feeling that Gates, even to protect the president, to say nothing of the rest of the government, would be able to have that conversation.
No, it doesn't sound that way. It sounds, look, I get the point that the president-elect wants to be a disruptor, and he wants to put people who can do the disruption. And I think that if I was to advise him, I would say you want somebody who can disrupt, but do it in a way that's in accordance with the Constitution. It may be something completely separate and apart from what has been normal protocol for the Justice Department. But I think at the end of the day, you want to make sure you're not going to violate the Constitution, because that has all sorts of ramifications that can come back and really hurt the president, undermine the presidency. You mentioned the Nixon administration. You had that problem there. When George W. Bush, under whom I served, appointed Alberto Gonzales, I think Alberto Gonzales, when he first started thinking he was running a law firm for the president as opposed to running the Justice Department. And that came back to bite not only the Attorney General, but the president as well. And so I think there's plenty of incidents in history here where a president should say, look, I want somebody to carry out my policies. I want somebody to disrupt. I want somebody to do something entirely different at the Justice Department. Get rid of senior people, whatever. But you need somebody who's going to be able to say to him, I hear what you want to do. This is the way we should do it lawfully.
Right. Now, and then let me show you, before I lose you, I want to have you respond to an incoming Democratic senator talking about the legal issue of the use of the military here. Take a listen.
I don't think Arizonans or Americans in general want to replace the chaos at the border with chaos in our communities. And the idea that soldiers are going to be carrying out these types of deportations, I think, number one, it's just not something that we in the United States are used to seeing. Number two, you'll actually really diminish the scope and the trust that people have for our military forces when they're being used against U.S. citizens, potentially, too.
Is this a valid use of the military? Is it good policy in your view?
I don't know about the policy issue. It gets to be a very complicated legal issue about when you can use the military force. And I think that you need somebody who is going to be able to weed through that very effectively and say to the president, I hear what you're trying to do. We got to find a different way to do it, or this is the way we can do it. I mean, remember, just in his last administration, Sally Yates stood up to him and say, you know, I'm the acting attorney general. I understand what you want to do with this Muslim ban. It's not legal. You can't do it. And she was later vindicated in the courts, and it caused some complication for the administration. There was a, bump in the beginning there with that. And I think the same thing needs to be happening here. I don't think there's anybody who can really say off the seat of their pants that what he wants to do, the way he proposes to do it, is legal or not. And as I said, the deployment of the military, first declaring a state of emergency and then using the military to act upon that, is not something that is an easy issue of law to be decided in 5 minutes.
Right. And then there's the question of whether you have the right people at DOJ and the military to do this in a good faith process, or whether Donald Trump wants to do it kind of backed in and says, I just want to see the soldiers in the streets. That's my goal. I don't care.
Yeah, and look, my advice, if I was his lawyer, I'd say, look, you really, at the end of the day, you want to be able to instill confidence, not just in half of the people. You want to instill the confidence in all the people that you're doing something the right way. They may disagree with what you're doing from a policy perspective, but I think you want to instill the confidence that is legal.
Former U.S. Attorney for the SDNY, David Kelly, thank you, our leadoff guest here on an issue that hits across both those topics, the deportation, the military power. I want to bring in a great Trump insider that you might recall later in the hour. Sarah Matthews will be here on these so-called loyalty tests. Rudy Giuliani has to pay, and that's true regardless of who controls the government in January, because he's facing accountability, losing his watches and cars. We have a report on that by the end of the hour. But first, General McCaffrey joins us here on these important developments on Ukraine and standing up to Putin, efforts by the current president to make a clear point before January.
The United States strongly supports Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Everyone around this table, in my view, should as well.
Remarks there from President Biden discussing a major foreign policy initiative right now. Of course, he's the outgoing president, but there's one president at a time, and he is the president. And the Biden administration is now authorizing Ukraine to strike Russia with American-supplied long-range missiles. This is one of the measures that Ukraine has sought. As they have said, they've been fighting at times with one hand behind their back. The United States has resisted this, trying to strike that balance between supporting Ukraine against Russia without supporting measures that were feared to potentially cause the kind of escalation that they didn't want to become a wider war. Meanwhile, North Korea, we should note, has deployed thousands of troops to Russia in support of their side in the Ukraine war. I'm joined now by retired General Barry McCaffrey, an MSNBC analyst. Welcome.
Good to be with you, Ari.
On the foreign policy, what do you see the Biden administration doing, and how does this work when you are in a transition period?
Well, it's a significant move. This Army ATACMS missile has a range of about 300 kilometers. It will change to some extent the parameters on the battlefield. The Russians, as we know, have brought in at least 10,000 North Korean troops. There may be as many as 100,000 headed there. They've got significant support out of Iran with attack drone missiles. So it's a desperate situation for Ukraine, fighting for its survival. I think it also probably is viewed to help set up a potential negotiation when the Trump administration comes into office. Having said that, it's too little, too late, will not have a significant military impact in the battle.
Knowing that the next president comes in on Jan 20, and as you referenced, has signaled something very different, warmer to Putin, colder to Ukraine, although in fairness, he's also talked about brokering something. Does this somehow create an effort to strengthen Ukraine's hand in the short run, or it's just too little? When you say too little, too late, or I'm paraphrasing, like, is it not something where there's enough time for this to really do much before Jan 20?
Not enough time to really do something. A desperate situation inside Ukraine. The Russians have been attacking massively across the board against civilian targets, the electrical grid, the water system. It's a desperate situation for Zelensky and his leadership. And I might add now what could come out of all this, we might assume, if NATO is disempowered by the Trump administration, either legally or through just their declaration, they won't sustain Article 5 powers. It seems likely that Europe will not be fooled by all this and will increasingly step up to the challenge of confronting Putin. Certainly with Finland and Sweden now joining NATO, they have immense economic power. So that may be another factor that comes out of all this.
The military is in the news for more than one reason, and obviously you have a lawful election. The incoming president's going to make his plans and change foreign policy as he sees fit. But there are some reverberations that are different right now. The announcement of using the military on domestic soil is something we discussed at the top of the hour, of mass deportation. There's an NBC report that some people on Trump's transition team are discussing the idea that they could somehow court-martial military officers targeting those from the withdrawal in Afghanistan, throwing around the word, quote, treason. There are people aligned with the Trump transition team who have, I want to note, pushed back on this reporting. Your reaction?
Well, I think legally it's going to go nowhere. It's a political bomb that will erupt on Trump. There is a uniform code of military justice. It's a federal statute. It has a system. It has a military court of appeals. I think poor Mr. Trump thinks it's Stalin show trials, and he can command them to convict and sentence retired military officers, or for that matter, active duty. It isn't there. So we'll have to see how this plays out. But I think in the short run, it's going to be an incredible morale boost for the administration, perhaps, MAGA, but detrimental to the ability of the U.S. Armed Forces to operate. I've never heard anything like it. Why would the incoming nominee to be SecDef talk about firing the chairman of the JCS, who got his 4th star from President Trump in the earlier administration? So it's volatile. It's just an incredible situation.
Wanted to get your responses on that and appreciate that, General McCaffrey. Our thanks. Later in the show, we have the Rudy Giuliani accountability in court. And up next, Sarah Matthews is back. Stay with us. One of the most important job requirements, it would seem, for working for Donald Trump's second term is total loyalty. Politico reports prospects for jobs have been asked to file documents indicating everything they've done to support Trump. And we've heard the same in public.
It's about surrounding my father with people who are both competent and loyal.
The main thing for President Trump, he needs loyalty. He needs somebody that understands it, but's going to watch his back.
We have seen the jobs coming down to a kind of audition about loyalty. And if you have criticized them in the past, you have to make up for it. Take the FCC post, which regulates TV and radio and is of apparent interest to Trump. A Trump loyalist was installed there, who's the author of the famed Project 2025. While he was running for president, Trump was distancing himself from that project. This week, The Times says Trump is expected to invite Treasury contenders to Mar-a-Lago. Here are some responses from Democrats.
That's Trump's point, because what he wants to do with these nominees is establish that the Congress of the United States will not stand up to him with anything.
You have to have the right character. You have to have the right qualifications. You have to go through an actual vetting process.
I certainly hope that's the case and that we won't see nominees jammed through in recess appointments where there's no confirmation hearing.
If they will confirm Matt Gaetz, they will do anything he wants.
And if you go over to Saturday Night Live and you think about what are kind of the national punchlines that everyone can relate to, here's how it's playing there. Baldwin RFK Jr., which comes after his stint years past doing Donald Trump. He might have never expected all of these different roles he would end up playing based on the formation of the cabinet. We have someone who did serve in Trump's White House and who warned against some of this, Sarah Matthews, when we come back.
Point with these nominees, several of them, is there unqualification? Is there affirmative disqualification?
Disqualifications. It's a different approach to job search. I'm joined now by former Deputy White House Press Secretary Sarah Matthews, who served in the first Trump administration and resigned after the events of January 6th. Welcome back. I think it's your first time on the beat since the election. Your thoughts on these loyalty tests and how things are looking second term?
I think when we saw some of Trump's first nominations come out, some of them I was pleasantly surprised by. I was happy with. I will give credit where credit's due. Someone like Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, or John Ratcliffe as CIA Director, Tom Homan as Border Czar. Even if you don't like these people's politics, you can agree that they are qualified for these roles. But then some of the crazy picks started coming in. And that's where I think you're going to see majority of the cabinet and the administration shape up to look like. And that was something that I warned about in the run up to the election. And so obviously, I think like a Matt Gaetz pick for Attorney General, that's something that's concerning to me. Pete Hegseth at Department of Defense, I think that one's kind of flying under the radar a little bit more because people are so focused on the Gaetz pick. These are some of the ones that are alarming to me because I find them extremely unqualified. And it seems like the only qualifications that Trump was looking at was loyalty. And I think that also something is when you're looking at Gaetz or Hegseth or Tulsi Gabbard. He's looking at people who are conservative media darlings now, people who will go out and defend him, anything and everything that he does, and will not push back on him. And so that's what I warned about the administration taking shape to look like, and it kind of appears that that's the path that we're headed down.
When it comes to cabinet debate, again, historically, it's a key power of the Senate to advise and consent. And the way that works is that you have some sort of impact or leverage, even though parties have generally been pretty solicitous of the same party's proposals. Here you have picks that it's hard to imagine people defending. We know how Matt Gaetz stands among his own party. RFK Jr., if Barack Obama put forward RFK Jr. as a lifelong Democrat, pro-choice HHS person, you can imagine all the Republicans opposing. Now many are sort of pretending they like these picks or coming up with other reasons. Take a look.
We need real reformers up and down the cabinet, and I think President Trump has put forth qualified nominees.
There's not one person that I know of that hasn't met Matt Gaetz and has an opinion. So I wish him well. I hope he goes on and does good things for our country.
I think Gaetz deserves an opportunity, and hopefully the Senate will give him a fair shot.
President Trump has the prerogative to nominate the people that he...
To advise and consent. And so when there are nominees that Donald Trump is more than capable of putting forth, he can put up whoever he wants. It is the role of the Senate then to vet them. And I don't know if we're going to see a vetting take place because, look, he wants these recess appointments. Even today, Senator Rick Scott of Florida tweeted out that we should do recess appointments. And so I hope that the senators remember that they have a constitutional duty to vet these people. Unfortunately, I do think that you're going to see them reserve their political capital. I think that maybe they'll kill one of these nominations. If I had to guess, maybe Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, just because I think that there are enough people on Capitol Hill that loathe him and don't want to see him in that role. But I do think that most of these other nominees that might not necessarily be the most qualified will probably squeak through.
We've dealt with seriousness from much of the hour, a lot of what's going on. I have a photo to put on the screen people may have seen that is less serious, but it's sort of in the ballpark of what we're dealing with. We'll leave it up for a minute. Donald Trump Jr. shared it. You see, of course, him and his father. You see Elon Musk, who's playing this outsized role right now. Speaker Mike Johnson sort of perched there. And then RFK Jr., who apparently in some sort of ritual is being asked to pose with and maybe even eat and imbibe McDonald's, which cuts against everything he's stood for. And McDonald's, of course, figured into the campaign politics as well. So with the notation, Sarah, that this is not as serious a matter as some of what else we've covered tonight, you've been in the Trump orbit. What do you see as the purpose of a photo like this? Is the embarrassment for RFK Jr. deliberate or just happenstance? Where does this fit into this strange time we're in?
I think that the look on RFK Jr.'s face kind of says it all. I think that he clearly feels uncomfortable in this photo. And I do think that there is sometimes the embarrassment is the point. I think Donald Trump loves when people come begging and crawling back to him. And look, RFK Jr. blasted him on the campaign trail while he was still a candidate for president. And so I think that it is kind of funny when you pull up a photo like this to look at it. And something else that sticks out to me too, though, is the role that Elon Musk is playing in what is going to shape up to be the second Trump administration and how heavily he's putting in his input into the cabinet picks. And it almost feels like he's trying to be co-president here, but I don't see that relationship lasting too long. They might look happy in this photo, but there's just no way two men with that big of egos will survive. And Donald Trump will probably get sick of him eventually. So that's just my 2 cents on the situation.
No, that's interesting coming from you, Sarah Matthews, a former Trump White House aide. You spoke out against Donald Trump before this election, but giving us some insights into how that may work. He and Elon have been sort of having a mutual kind of excitement about each other from the closing of the campaign trail the last final weeks and what we've seen recently. But you're reminding everyone, based on what you've seen, that may not hold. Thanks for joining us. We'll be coming back to you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. When we come back, we have a lot more in the program, including an interesting story of redemption with the artist Shine by the end of the hour. But